Deep in the center of our skulls, there's a tiny, pea-sized gland called the pituitary. It's often called the master gland because it runs so many of our body's vital functions. But what happens when that master control center goes wrong? Today, we're diving into pituitary adenomas, tumors that grow in this critical spot. And we're going to trace the story from the very first symptom all the way down to the cellular level. So, what really happens when the master gland develops a tumor? Well, it turns out these growths, called adenomas, have two very different ways of making themselves known. It all comes down to what the tumor cells are actually doing, which brings us to the first major way we categorize them. You can think of these adenomas as having two distinct personalities, or two faces, and how they reveal themselves really depends on answering one simple question. Is the tumor pumping out extra hormones, or is it just sitting there, growing silently? That's the key distinction. And this slide lays it out perfectly. On one side, you've got functional adenomas. These are like little hormone factories gone haywire, just churning out massive quantities of one specific hormone. All that hormonal chaos creates really distinct symptoms, which often means they get discovered earlier. On the flip side, you have non-functional adenomas. They're the silent type. They don't produce any extra hormones, so they can grow for years without anyone knowing, until they get so big that their size alone starts causing major problems. Let's look at some classic examples of what these functional tumors do. If a tumor is overproducing growth hormone, in a child, it causes gigantism. In an adult, it leads to acromegaly, where your hands, feet, and facial features start to enlarge. If it's spitting out too much ACTH, that causes Cushing's disease, with its telltale weight gain and skin changes. And an excess of prolactin, that can cause all sorts of reproductive issues. You see, each syndrome is like a flashing neon sign pointing right back to the pituitary. Okay, so that's the story with the hormone-producing tumors. But what about those silent, non-functional ones? For them, the problem isn't about chemistry, it's about physics. It's all about physical space and the pressure that a growing mass puts on all the delicate structures packed inside your head. And when we talk about size, there's a really simple cutoff that pathologists use. If the tumor is less than 1 centimeter across, it's called a microadenoma. But if it's bigger than 1 centimeter, it gets upgraded to a macroadenoma. And it's those macroadenomas that cause all the trouble we call mass effects. And believe me, these mass effects are no joke. As a macroadenoma gets bigger, it can literally start squishing the optic chiasm. That's the crucial intersection where your optic nerves cross. This leads to a very specific kind of tunnel vision. The pressure also causes terrible headaches. And the real irony? This growing tumor can actually crush and destroy the healthy part of the pituitary, causing the gland to fail. So you go from a tumor that does nothing to having a pituitary that can't do its job at all. And these large tumors don't just push things around, they can be incredibly destructive. They can actually start to erode the bone of your skull and push their way into the nearby sinuses. And because they often grow so fast, they can't keep up with their own blood supply, which leads to areas of bleeding and dead tissue right inside the tumor itself. All right, so we've seen how these tumors show up for a patient and their doctor. Now, let's totally shift gears. Let's put on our lab coats and look at this from a pathologist's point of view. What do these adenomas actually look like, first with the naked eye and then under the microscope? So if you were to see one of these, it's usually a soft, well-defined little mass sitting right there in its bony home, the sella turcica. As we just said, the bigger ones often show those signs of growing too fast, those spots of hemorrhage and necrosis. But here's a really key detail. In up to a third of cases, these tumors don't have a nice, neat capsule around them. And that lack of a boundary means they're much more likely to start infiltrating and invading the tissues around them. Now, zoom in with a microscope, and the difference is just night and day. A healthy pituitary is like a vibrant city full of all different kinds of cells, all supported by this intricate scaffolding of fibers called reticulin. But a pituitary adenoma, it's the exact opposite. You see what's called cellular monomorphism. It's just endless sheets of the exact same cell, one single clone that's copied itself over and over. And that supportive reticulin network, it's either completely gone or totally smashed. Those two things, the uniform cells and the rect framework, are the absolute defining features of a pituitary adenoma under the microscope. So you have to ask, right? What makes these cells all become the same? What makes them lose their structure and grow out of control? To answer that, we have to go even deeper, all the way down to the genetic blueprint, to the DNA itself. So, first things first, It's really important to know that the vast majority of these tumors are sporadic. They just happen, seemingly out of the blue. But in about 5% of cases, there's a direct inherited link. They actually run in families because of a specific genetic mutation that gets passed down. And for those families, scientists have zeroed in on a few key genetic culprits. A mutation in the MEN1 gene, for example, causes a syndrome where people get tumors in several of their endocrine glands. Other genes like CDKN1B and AIP are also known bad actors, with AIP mutations being especially known for causing growth hormone tumors in younger people. But what about the other 95% of cases, the sporadic ones? Well, this is where it gets really fascinating. The most well-understood genetic mistake involves a gene called GNAS1, and this chart shows its impact perfectly. In about 40% of all those growth hormone-secreting tumors we talked about, you'll find a mutation in this one gene. So how does this one mutation cause so much trouble? The best way to picture it is like a light switch that's been broken and is now permanently stuck in the on position. The GNS gene is part of a signaling pathway. The mutation breaks the off switch. With the pathway always on, it creates a flood of a messenger molecule, which then screams at the cell 24/7 to divide and pump out hormones. And that relentless signal is what builds the tumor. And finally, there's one more gene pathologists really watch out for, TP53. Now, TP53 is one of the body's most important guards against cancer. So when you find a mutation in it inside a pituitary adenoma, that is a huge red flag. It tells doctors that this isn't a standard tumor, it's what they call an atypical adenoma, and it's likely to be way more aggressive, more invasive, and much more likely to come back after treatment. Okay, we have covered a ton of ground here. We've gone from the symptoms a person feels, to the physical size of the tumor, to what it looks like under a microscope, and right down to its broken genetic code. So now let's pull it all together into one single unifying idea. This is really the heart of the matter, the big takeaway. The symptoms all come down to function versus size. If the tumor is functional, you get a hormonal syndrome. If it's large and non-functional, you get neurological problems from the physical pressure. But no matter how they act, when you look at them under a microscope, they are all the same thing, a uniform clonal mass of cells that has forgotten its place and lost its architectural support. Understanding this entire story, this cellular blueprint, is absolutely critical for making a diagnosis and predicting how a tumor is going to behave. But it also leaves us with a huge forward-looking question. If we now know the blueprint for how these tumors are made, from the genes on up, could that very same blueprint also be the map that finally leads us to a cure?